Alrighty, we are live.
Hey, what's up, guys?
How's it going?
We're doing it live, damn it.
Oh.
Careful, you don't want to end up with 13 sexual harassment lawsuits one day.
Or does he?
And someone's already noticed the pillow count.
What are they talking about?
I don't know what they're talking about. I don't see a pillow here.
I don't sleep on a pillow.
Do you sleep?
There's the question.
Alrighty. So welcome back, everyone. This is the Retro Roundtable. As usual, we'll do our thing of going around with individual topics, and we're going to be kind of light on the group stuff. We didn't really plan stuff too much for that because we have a lot of questions backlogged that we thought we should answer for once. And then we'll probably take questions from the chat after, I guess. If people have anything we want to talk about, we can just riff on that for a while. And Bob, are you going to be with us the whole time, or you got a lot of work to do back there?
I think I'll be here. If you see me fumbling around, I am paying attention 100%, I swear. I'll be taking notes as diligently as Steve was last time.
Cool. All right, who wants to kick it off this week?
I guess I'll go since I said I'd go first last time.
Cool.
So I've been working a lot on Dreamcast stuff lately, and most of my talks here have been on that, and nothing really bite-sized stood out at me. So I almost had nothing until yesterday. I went to the hackerspace because I go every 2 weeks to an embedded systems meetup on every other Monday. And the guy who runs the meetup, he asked me a interesting question. He was trying to he wanted to run those NeoPixel LED strips. I don't know if you guys seen those. They're like RGB LEDs, and it's like a serial chain. And Arduinos, Raspberry Pis have APIs to program and display the colors how you want, flash them how you want. And he was working on some sort of project where he wanted to send that via RS-485 to some like really far destination. And so the RS-485 drivers have speed specs on them, and he wanted to know basically what his maximum throughput was in like how it equated down into the analog domain. So it kind of bubbled down to just a more basic question where he had the data sheet and it showed the waveforms on how this NeoPixel thing works, where for a logic high it was it's weird, it was a different duty cycle pulse than a logic low. It was like, I think the duration of the high plus the low was like 1.25 microseconds, and for a logic high it was like 600 nanoseconds high and 700 nanoseconds low, and if it was a low it was like 900 nanoseconds high and something else. So it was like a different thing. I don't remember the exact numbers, and his basically was like, how does this translate into like the bandwidth like an amplifier would need to drive something like this? And so I kind of dug out my old communication electronics book, and it was actually kind of interesting. So I guess I'm talking about that right now. And it kind of bubbles down to your ideal. I'm going to do this whole ghetto piece of paper thing again.
You can send me pictures before the stream, and I can like put them up if you want.
I can't see them. I can't see them.
Yeah, that's fair.
So it doesn't matter. So if you think of like a ideal rectangular pulse as just like like a bit, right? In the time domain, it just has a width and it has some height, and so it has some energy, which is really in this case is the area in this pulse width. So it's like, the area of a rectangle. And there's this theorem, and don't freak out because it's actually pretty simple, even though I'm going to show the crazy equation called Parseval's theorem, where it says all the energy in your time domain is equal to all your energy in your frequency domain. It's the same amount of energy. So one representation of the energy is equal to the other representation of the energy. And so if you take that rectangular pulse and you look at it in the frequency domain, it looks like this, where it has this main lobe and it's got all these little side lobes that go out into infinity. So this type of signal, this pulse, this hard, really perfect looking rectangle, equates to a frequency that goes on forever. It's not band limited. It has infinite frequency components. And for practical use, that's pretty not practical. You can't really work with something that has frequency components to forever. And so what they have a term for different types of pulses, different types of waveforms, is what is the essential bandwidth of this signal. And like what's obvious, it's like, hey, we want most of the energy is concentrated in this main center part. So why don't we just take the bandwidth to be this and get about all the extra stuff? And so you could do that. You could filter, or if you just consider the frequency components here, and now I have these kind of blacked out down to 0. So these don't exist anymore. So if I do that, let's say I filter this down and filter out all those extra stuff, and then I look back in the time domain, then I showed the original pulse in dots. But now if you see, my energy that was all those extra components is gone now, and that's where these missing areas here were. So let's say that was 90% of the energy was in that main lobe. Now I have 90% energy in the time representation, and the 10% that was missing are here and here. So is this good enough, basically? Is this enough for reliable transmission? And I mean, it depends on your application, but there's a reason why they pick, for rectangular pulses, it's common to just pick this part, and this is 90%. And if you use 90%, there's an equation that gets you what your frequency is based on the width of your pulse. So let's say let's go back to the problem at hand, which was my friend had these pulse widths, and he wanted to be able to represent them reliably in transmission. I think the smallest one was 300 nanoseconds. So there's actually an equation, and it comes down to 1 over the pulse width. So it'd be 1 over 300 nanoseconds. So let's do that real quick. And that's around 3.3 megahertz. So his amplifiers, to support 90% of that singular pulse energy, so it still looks kind of like a rectangular pulse, you would need something that's 3.3 megahertz of bandwidth, analog bandwidth. So I hope that made sense. I thought it was kind of interesting looking at this stuff again. I might have repeated myself, or whatever. I'm kind of winging it right now. But yeah, I don't know.
Great job. Made sense.
All right, I reached one person.
So how is he using this information in his project? Has he figured out whether this is sufficient for his?
I told him I'd get back to him.
Oh, okay. So you haven't filled him in on this yet.
Because he asked me, and I was like, oh, I feel like I remember this stuff. And then I looked through all my books, and then this is what I came up with. And so I mean, I'll either write him an email and explain this, or maybe I'll just put a link to this video.
Yeah.
Well, for people who are wondering what it is, if you go to adafruit.com, they sell a lot of NeoPixel stuff, so they can go on there in the shop and have a look at what the application is, what you were trying to help the guy with.
Yeah, I think there's a data sheet up there or something, and you could see what I was talking about on these different pulse widths. And I guess you would want the minimum, the smallest one is the one that has the highest bandwidth you need to support.
Yeah.
Cool.
I'll go
Sweet.
just to get it out of the way. I really don't have a really nicely meaningful update, but I can tell you what's happened or what's been happening. The new inventory should be here by the weekend, hopefully. And at this point, everything will be ready to go the moment it gets here, because I'm having Fabrication House do a few more things just to take out some more busy work for me. But in the meantime of doing all that, I've been quite overwhelmed with
Fixing
services.
Bob's crap.
Fixing Bob's crap, which I just fixed.
No. Those are your kickbacks, remember?
All right. Yeah, that's right.
Oh, I'm sorry. I
Of
have.
course.
Those are the benefits. Not...
Bob has this nasty habit of sending me the most broken shit you'd ever find on the face of this earth to me, so I can fix it for him and he can resell it to make mad money. So, other than Bob,
Not always. That's a new thing. It's usually for me. And for the record, I always say such nice things like, if it's fixable, send it back, but if it's broken, you can keep it.
you're such a cock. At any rate, other than Bob, I've just really been overwhelmed with really mod work and just trying to turn stuff out just as fast as I can. I've got a lot of professional things I have to do on top of, all of this stuff. So time has been really limited. But with all the other projects like the AES and stuff like that, I'm kind of waiting for things right now so I can continue moving on those. But those are still going quite nicely. I've been doing some other things. A lot for the longest time, I've been asked about PlayStation 1 systems that have been properly modded to output a nicely shaped composite sync signal, whilst sacrificing composite video, because people don't care about composite video, right? Well, I've done that, and I've actually got a pretty good doodad that handles that. So on the store, while I'm waiting for inventory, I'm getting ready to put up a bunch of fat, what I'm saying, fat PS1s. Shut up. Bob, don't smile and don't look at me. Just continue doing what you're doing back there. Anyways, I'm getting ready. See, Bob kills me. I'm getting ready to put up a bunch of fat PS1s that have had full-on laser calibration. They've been modified to an extent, and they output a properly attenuated and nicely shaped composite sync. So there'll be PS1 minis and PS1 fats. I don't expect to do this ever again in the future. I just have a pretty plentiful supply of these from over the years, and I need to get rid of them. But I thought, a lot of people still ask for this stuff, so why not? So I'm doing that, and that's really kind of what I've been working on, honoring service requests and mod work, trying to move some inventory, and I'm waiting for new inventory to come in, and I'm waiting for some parts to come in for some AES stuff. But AES, RGB, and the Commodore 64 thing, those are still very well going on. I just don't have a good update for you on those things yet. That's all.
Cool.
Okay. I can go. I have a few small things to say. First is I'm not drinking beer. I'm trying to get back into shape. I started jogging to be like this tea.
So you think Diet Coke is going to be a step to...
Yeah, I was about to say. Yeah.
But it's not beer, so I guess that's a positive.
I'll take the beer. Fuck it.
I have to go jogging after this, so... next thing is I did post a lot of inventory on the website just before the weekend, but sadly it's all sold out. So if you started jumping in your seat, you can't buy one because it's already all gone.
You're a horrible human being, René.
Thank you. So what else? I mean, I brought in my my conversion cab for Neo Geo indoors, and I'm going to start working on it soon. Really excited to have a Neo Geo playable in my house, even though it's not like technically a real cab. It was a conversion cab, but hey, there was one point in the life of this cabinet where many kids went to the arcade and they said, "Oh, that's a Neo Geo." So I think spiritually, it's a Neo Geo, so that's fine. And for my individual topic, there was a lot of bullshit debate about emulation versus simulation and why FPGAs are magical and why they're an accurate and 100% reproduction of the original hardware. So to address that, I want to talk a bit about how FPGAs work. And before I begin, I want to make sure everybody understands I'm not trying to diss any work that anybody's done on an FPGA, right? That's not the point. I just want to explain how they work so people can understand that they're not magic and they're not inherently perfect. I mean, if you could have just as good as an emulator in software as you could in hardware. So what I want to, theoretically, yeah. So what I want to do is I'm going to take this whiteboard and I want to show just a quick implementation in real hardware, then in software and in an FPGA of how each solution would implement an AND gate, right? Something really, really, really simple. So if we look at the simplest version of an AND gate, it would actually, I mean, in an RTL kind of circuit, it would look something like this, right, with a resistor on top to V+. You guys see all of this?
Sure.
Okay.
I do. It for me, it's a little super compressed, but I don't know if it's just my connection or something.
It's better on YouTube. You can see it.
Okay. Cool.
Then I would go plus V here, and then the output Y would be here. So this is kind of the simplest implementation of an AND gate, right? So if we're going to emulate an AND gate in software, it's obviously not going to behave exactly like this hardware resistor and transistor AND gate. So something that a way that it could be done is, and I'm just going to use the Z80 as an example here, is we'd have some sort of black box, right, where bit 0 and bit 1 come in. And then we're going to have a series of instructions. And, well, I'm not going to actually, I actually wrote out a little Z80 program that can emulate an AND gate, but it's probably going to be too small for you guys to see here. But anyway, so let's picture there's some lines of code in here, and at the output, we get our AND gate, right? So there's a finite and measurable amount of time between, the inputs changing here and it affecting the output, and that's directly proportional to the clock speed, right? So that's kind of how a CPU implementation would do it. And then if we're talking about an FPGA, and I have to raise the whiteboard here, so this is getting kind of flimsy. I'm going to suppose we have a 2-input LUT FPGA, and that's a lookup table. And for people who don't know what a lookup table is, don't worry, I'm going to explain it right away. So the basic building block of an FPGA is usually something like a lookup table with a bit of surrounding logic. So what will happen is we'll still have our inputs A and B, and then there's going to be a block of RAM. And because this is a 2-input LUT, there's going to be 4 memory spaces assigned to this LUT. And they each enumerate the different possible binary states of A and B. And using RAM, the FPGA is just going to make like a truth table of where the outputs needs to be 0, where the output needs to be 1. So for an AND gate, it's going to look like this. And then this is going to go to the output Y. And usually, I mean, for completeness, an FPGA will also take the Y output and mux it.
You raise it a little higher.
Yeah, a little higher. Higher.
Sorry.
There you
This
go.
is getting really hard. There we go. And there's going to be a multiplexer here. And this is going to go to a flip-flop. The D input. And then we're going to have the clock. And the Q output. There we go. And maybe even a reset. There. So every possible state of A and B can be represented with this lookup table, and we can even register the output using that. So, I mean, I think what's really important here to note is both the CPU and the FPGA can behaviorally accomplish what A and B does, but what happens in between in the transitions is completely different in the CPU implementation and in the FPGA implementation. And I think something interesting to note is that the CPU implementation is actually going to be glitch-free, right? There's never going to be any intermediate states if you're trying to implement any kind of logic in a CPU, right? Whereas if A and B are both changing from 0 to 1, there's going to be some weird glitches at the output.
Well, can't the CPU? What if A changes when it's loading A into a register?
Yeah, that's Also, just to quickly add to that, like other things have to be like taken into consideration. Like with the Z80, for example, how many cycles does it take for the instruction for the opcode to decode into an instruction, and how long does it take to get for it to go into the pipeline? I mean, like maybe I'm thinking about this too technically.
There's definitely timing involved. You're absolutely right. The CPU implementation is going to be many times slower, but
it can be slower if you run the CPU clock at gigahertz and you run your
okay. Let me rephrase that. With an equivalent clock rate, the CPU solution is going to be a lot slower. But because the CPU implementation is always registered, right? It's always going to be reading a defined state of either A or B and making a judgment based on that. Whereas, we're going to have glitch conditions in the other two scenarios. And I mean, those glitch conditions aren't bad. I mean, they were present in the original design. But whether you make an AND gate with the FPGA or with a CPU or with this, there's no magic anywhere, right? There's no simulation of what this circuit happens. I mean, you can simulate this right here in SPICE.
Yeah.
Right? And you can emulate its behavior with an FPGA or with a CPU.
So, René, I have a question. Like, what your position is, and I totally 100% agree with you. Despite it being in software or hardware, the accuracy or quality is only as good as it's as good as the implementation itself. So, like,
that's correct. I mean, you can abstract this to a much more complex circuit, right? And if you don't evaluate correctly what's going on in here, it doesn't matter if you write a piece of assembly that does it or a piece of VHDL that does it. You're still going to be wrong. So
an example here's a good example, because this is kind of my area here too. Like 6502 architecture. Like knowing, like even like the small, if you're wanting to replicate that behavior, knowing every little morsel and nuance of it. For example, every time you pass a page barrier in memory, there's a penalty. There are extra cycles involved for every page boundary that you pass when addressing memory or accessing memory with the 6502 system. So if you don't know that, or if that is not, even little small details like that, if that's not properly implemented, you may run into problems, and that's both for like in software and in hardware. It's just little stuff like that, right? Is that what we're talking about? In a lot of respects, like just knowing, it's all about understanding.
My point is, it's all about knowing. I mean, if a software designer and a hardware designer both use the same erroneous material, erroneous documentation to produce an emulated version of a system, they're both going to be wrong. It doesn't matter if one's
in the same place.
Yeah, it doesn't matter if one's in an FPGA or one's in a CPU. The FPGA solution is not more magical because it's an FPGA.
Right. So to your point, would you say that an FPGA, a hardware implementation, is still in essence emulation? For example, an example that would be, the bulk of the Sega Genesis systems that were made post 1991, they integrated the sound, the bus I/O, and a lot of things that used to be separate chips into an ASIC. Now, if we follow that logic, would those later generations that employed ASICs, would that be an emulation system?
To me, emulation is, I want to model what happens to Y with respect to how I change A and B. I want to model the logic of this, right? Simulation is, well, we're going to start looking at the VCE saturation of this transistor in this one, and what's the parasitic capacitance here, and so on. That's a simulation.
Gotcha. That makes total sense. I think people, it's really easy to get that confused. And I agree with you 100% on your interpretation of the King James Bible. So,
and there are available. Oh, sorry, Bob. I'm going to close this up. There are available CPU simulations out there. There's actually a website called visual6502.org. You can go on that website, and there's a Java simulation of the silicon die of a 6502, and you can single step through programs, and it's not trying to do any sort of VHDL or logic calculation of what's going on in there. It's actually simulating the behavior of the silicon to give you an output. So that's a real CPU simulation.
Right. Good example, René.
Go ahead, Bob. You were going to say something?
Well, yeah. I mean, first of all, thank you for doing that, René. It's I'm one of those people that learns easier with visual cues like that. So thank you. But I think the issue is if the first popular FPGA cores to hit, the first ones that not just the nerds like us mess with, but the public, if the first ones that were released were buggy and laggy and didn't work right, we would never be having this conversation.
I would argue that the ones that already happened, those NES on a chips, are effectively just hardware reimplementations of the NES, and they weren't implemented well. So.
Right. And I think it's not an issue, it's a good thing, but the problem is that when you have somebody that's a perfectionist and that loves this stuff, like Kevtris, and he puts out, I mean, as close to perfect as humanly possible. No, of course, it's not the original chips, but, when you have an experience that even a crazy person like me cannot tell the difference between the original, it starts to blur the line. Whereas, from what I've seen and from what a lot of people that have dove pretty deep into this, you could actually use software emulation on old stuff and get pretty much zero lag. A modern computer, very fast video card, and you're emulating something from the early 80s. It could be done. I just think that because Kevtris did such a good job on his cores, that's what blurs the line, and people are trying to find a way to differentiate that. And I almost wish there was a bunch of garbage FPGA solutions first, just so we'd understand the difference. But yeah, I mean, I'm glad you explained it with visual cues. I'm able to grasp the concept a bit better now. The way Kevtris put it was he programs in Verilog, which is a hardware programming language, and not in a software language. So that's how he differentiates it.
But you write behavioral code. You write the behavior in Verilog, and then the behavior is implemented in the lookup tables and flip-flops like René was talking about.
But the code is still like if then else, and kind of looks a bit like C, especially Verilogs.
I mean, I think a lot of this debate centers around, at least on my end, the difference between the marketing aspect and what's actually going on. I mean, I understand why people want to use a differentiating term like simulation. I think actually Kevtris himself suggested that term for what's going on, which is fine, but I mean, at the end of the day, it's just a way to differentiate. It's still at its core level emulation, because all emulation means is it's one type of hardware behaving like something else. And 100%. There's nothing wrong with that. That doesn't say one thing is better than the other. It's not bad because it's emulation. It's still emulation.
Yeah, I think there was someone on Twitter who hit the nail on the head. Like, it's because there's so much history with the word emulation with software, and it could be bad that, like Bob said, we're looking for a new term that just easily makes it just black and white for people. And it doesn't, if you want to talk about it accurately and truthfully, you can't, because they're both emulation. But we talked about this all theoretically, but I wanted to point out that practically, it's way more efficient and easier to implement a lot of this logic in hardware because of the behavior is in that such a way where you have clocks and combinational logic and flip-flops, and that's what the FPGA implements stuff in, and it has those basic building blocks at the core, so it's much easier to make a practical implementation that's accurate than in software. And we did a whole hour on this too, and it was like all OS was a big bottleneck and all that stuff.
Yeah, the only thing that annoys me is when people on Twitter really get into analyzing what Analog NT's marketing was about, and it's like, that's the wrong argument. Chris Tabor is very clearly awesome at his marketing because he has, I mean, within 3 seconds after the announcement was emailed out, all those major publications posted. The dude very clearly knows what he's doing from the marketing side, so don't look into the marketing terms. Just, we're nerds. We know what marketing is. We know what nerds do. Just let that go. I don't even want to, like, I wouldn't even entertain a response to any of those. And I mean that in a good way. You know, everybody, Kevtris is awesome at what he does. Chris is great at what he does. They don't try to tell each other what to do, so fucking perfect. But yeah, don't look too far into marketing terms.
I think we're really lucky to have Kevtris. Someone who's been working on this stuff for years and has all this knowledge and really wants it to be right, instead of some Chinese manufacturer trying to just whip up something quick and throw it out.
Agreed 100%. And he's such a nice dude, too. Every time I talk to him, he's real easy to talk to and just very nice. So good for Kevtris.
He's one of the nicest people I think I've ever met or have ever spoken to. He's just really, really good-natured. Super good-natured.
Just remember that if he doesn't open source it, then it's no value to the community.
Oh yeah, I forgot he's evil until he open sources it.
Are you talking? Are we going to get the whole preservation versus monetization thing?
That's all right.
Please, God, don't get me going. Unless you want, you can get me going. I'll go.
I can go next.
Go.
All right. Give me a second here. I gotta pull up an image.
Great.
Because I wanted to talk about interpolation real quick, because one of my pet peeves is the terms in this kind of get mucked up a lot, and I just wanted to, I don't know, maybe I'll do more than one part of this series because it's a super rich topic with lots of things going on, but for now I'll just start with like kind of an overview of interpolation. And to really understand what interpolation means, you really have to know what sampling is. So in this top picture I have here, starting from the left, you have some continuous time signal, and in the second picture you've taken some samples of it. So the red X's are just every period of time I've written down what the value of that signal was at that time, and I've stored it off to get that third picture, which is just the digital representation of it. And so that's kind of where interpolation comes in after that, is I have these samples and maybe there's something else I want to know about this signal. So interpolation doesn't necessarily mean upsampling a signal. Interpolation can be used for lots of things. Really all it is understanding what that underlying continuous time signal originally was, so that you can do something like upsample it. But you could also, if you've ever seen an image rotated at like 45 degrees, it could have the exact same number of pixels, but it's on a completely different sampling grid. That's also interpolation. So it's really just taking that digital representation, understanding the underlying continuous, and then maybe resampling it for some other purpose. That's kind of the basic background. And so what I show here is kind of the general sync interpolation, which is like the ideal case of interpolation, is if you have some band limited signal or your frequencies are all contained below some value and you sample it fast enough, all you have to do is drop in this little sync waveform, which is that blue squiggly thing, at each point, and you sum them all up and you get your original signal back. And then you can do something like resample it twice as fast, and now you've gotten a 2 times upsampling. So to go a little bit beyond that, you can do stuff like this completely in the digital domain. You don't actually have to create an analog signal again and resample it. So on this second row, I'm showing a 2 times upsample and how you would do it in the digital domain. So there's 2 steps generally the way we represent it as signal processing guys. The first step is an upsampler, which just drops in zeros in between your existing samples. In the case of 2 times upsample, we just add 1 sample in between each. You would add more zeros for higher upsample rates, and then you filter it with something called H. And that H can be a lot of things, and it really depends on your assumptions about the underlying signal or what you want to accomplish. So in this case, I've just pretended that we've used this ideal interpolator sync signal and filled everything back in. But that's not always the case, and actually that's pretty much never the case, because that is really impractical. It kind of dovetails in with what Steve's talking about. You cannot really represent a sync signal like that because it's infinitely long. Yoink. And so you might do other things, like you assume you've sampled fast enough so that you can just draw straight lines between every point and fill in things that way. That would be your linear interpolation. Or what you can do is just copy the previous sample, and that's often called nearest neighbor interpolation or zero order interpolation. This kind of goes to the whole reason I wanted to bring this up. This is all integer interpolation. All this means is you've upsampled by an integer factor, in this case 2. So there's nothing really meaningful about saying that. It doesn't mean that all of a sudden your retro games are going to look perfect because you did integer upsampling. Because what you really have to specify is that filter H. What are you doing? What is your underlying assumptions? The case with retro games, as we've kind of talked about before, is they really violate all of the assumptions you make about normal images. They are very much not band limited. And you actually want to use something like nearest neighbor interpolation to achieve the look that you're going for. But that's not something that you would ordinarily do in most other cases.
Which is why normal TVs a lot of times smear retro gaming images.
Right. Their assumption is you have normal content that's sampled fast enough where doing a linear interpolation is going to look good, and that's correct most of the time for what you throw at it. And so I guess the last thing I wanted to say is, what is non-integer interpolation? Well, it's actually the way you would accomplish that is, for example, you could do an integer upsampling followed by an integer downsampling to achieve that. So in the last kind of section below there, I'd show how you would, in practice, go from a 240p signal to a 1080p signal. You would upsample by a factor of 9. There's a couple of filter steps there. In reality, it's probably just one filter, and then you could downsample. And so there's nothing like incredibly interesting about something being non-integer, other than some things that I could probably get into next time, because it'll take a little bit longer to discuss. But you can get some oddities with the number of samples used to represent what used to just be 1 or 2 pixels before might not match another section of the image where you used the same number of pixels to represent a different color. So you can get some little weird quirks like that, but that's kind of the extent of it. It's not a quality of interpolation thing that you're dealing with when you have non-integer rates.
Nick, may I ask a question?
Sure.
So let's say that you have a 240 progressive signal and you upsample that by a factor of 3, which I guess is 720, right?
Mm-hmm.
Okay, so let's say that you have a 1080p TV, a panel, a 1080p television panel, right? That's its native resolution. You often hear about, up converting or upsampling to 720p will yield a perfect pixel uniformity, and because it's a device, 240 is divisible of 720, so it's an integer scaling. But what I guess I'm confused about is, it's just a question that should be asked. Even if you have a 720 integer scale from like an OSSC or a FrameMeister, and you're shitting that out to your television, which is a 1080p 1080p panel, isn't there still a process of interpolation at that chain to up that up?
Yeah. So
is that kind of a wrong? Is that sort of a incorrect moniker to use? Like, it's integer scale, therefore it's perfect on X television with a 1080p panel. You understand what I'm asking?
Yeah, no, I totally get what you're asking. I mean, there's a lot of stuff kind of in the mix there to talk about, but let's say you were using an OSSC, right? And you were, because the OSSC is doing the type of interpolation that your retro games want to do. So you were going to take your 240p, you were going to nearest neighbor, upsample this to 720. Let's say you put it on the 3x mode.
Okay.
And then you're going to feed that signal into your 1080 TV. Your TV is going to do that non-integer sampling. That's like a 1.5 step, right? So you've gotten yourself most of the way there using the type of interpolation that you want to achieve. So let's assume that your TV is doing linear the rest of the way. It's not going to look as blurry as if you were to throw a 240p signal and linearly interpolate that to 1080. But okay, at the end of the day, if you're going from 240 to 1080, there's 0% chance that you're doing an integer scale interpolation, unless you're doing something like what the OSSC does at 5x, which is blow it up 5 times, you have too much information there, and then you just throw some of it away. You cut off the tops and the bottoms. Then you can achieve this integer scale. But if you're going to feed it 720, yeah, it's going to look better because you integer scale it the way you wanted to most of the way there, but there's still a little bit of linear interpolation at the tail end there.
So despite the fact that you're letting this processor upsample to 240 to 720, and then your TV takes care of it from 720 to its native resolution, which is 1080. It's not correct to say that is a integer scaling that will yield perfect pixel uniformity. In other words, whereas opposed to if you had what if you had a 720p panel and you had the OSSC up convert to line triple your 240? That would be
then you got your perfect perfect integer. Right. And so yeah, the pixel uniformity thing, which I'll try to draw out pictures for next time as to what can go on there. It's pretty simple to understand, but I think it takes some pictures to really lay it out.
It's infinitely easier to show pictures than it is to describe, because what you just described, I've seen a million times where, like, the best example is you line triple 240p to 720p, and that looks perfect on like a capture card or something, and then you stick it on a 1080p TV that stretches it differently, and now it screws everything all up.
Yeah, I mean, so in my case, I use the OSSC to bring my Genesis up to a 720 and then throw it on my 1080 TV. It looks perfect. So there are individual sets that might be doing goofy things with a 720 signal, but as far as the upsampling piece to 1080, there's nothing really inherently negative about doing another 1.5 times upscale.
So it's just to summarize your whole thing here, you just want to make it clear that integer upscaling is disjoint from nearest neighbor type of interpolation.
Right. So integer upscaling doesn't tell me anything, really.
Yeah.
What tells me everything is what choice of filter did I use. What are the assumptions about my underlying signal that I made when I chose that filter? Were they true? And it'll also tell you when you pick that filter how many samples you'll need in memory, right? So that's another huge part of this is if I pick a really complex filter, I'm going to need to store like maybe a dozen lines to compute my new rows that I want to fill in. Whereas if I'm doing nearest neighbor, I can do it in real time, right? Because it's just the previous line that I'm copying.
Right. That makes sense.
So if you did your sync, you would need your infinite number of lines.
Right, yeah.
It goes up and down.
Yeah,
You
exactly.
need an infinitely large screen.
So yeah, that's all I wanted to talk about. Thanks for humoring me.
So Nick, if I understood correctly, is integer scaling is like FPGAs, right? It's somehow magical.
Yeah, it's magical. It solves every problem. I mean, I don't want to downplay. There are some issues there, but it's kind of unrelated to the nearest neighbor piece of it as to why things look good when you upsample using an OSSC.
Gotcha.
It's just everyone's desire is to oversimplify and make things easier, right? So
Right.
That's what I'm talking about. This where there are little differences.
Yeah.
That
Bob, you got anything for us?
Nope, nothing interesting's happened to me the past week or two. Nothing interesting at all.
Good, moving on.
Yeah. I've been selling a bunch of shit, and in the process, I've actually been going back over and replaying with some projects that I really wanted to mess with before. Like, the original intent was always like, I'm going to buy this thing, I'm going to mod it, do a video, add a page to the website, and then leave it in my pile of crap and maybe use it, once in my life. I'm clearing out all of that, but I'm really trying to go back and anything that I missed that I feel like might be important, go back on. And one of the things that was driving me crazy is a lot of PS2 stuff, which is kind of ironic and funny because I rarely play PlayStation 2. But one of the things was that being able to use HDLoader to play PlayStation 1 games using the Pop Starter emulator, and I still haven't figured that out at all. The documentation online is garbage, and when I asked questions on the Assembler Games forum, they just, they treated me like people normally treat people on forums. So that kind of
they were welcoming.
So.
They were welcoming with open arms, right?
Exactly. One of them just responded with a link to a guide that makes no sense whatsoever. And that's kind of, I'm always the first to admit, I like having friends that are smarter than me. I'm not great at all this stuff, but I'm pretty decent at taking a guide and being able to explain shit to everybody. And so when I look at these guides, that assumes that you've already done step 1 through 10 and starts you at step 11 as if it was the first thing, drives me fucking nuts. Like, I can't even figure out how to do a PS1 partition on a PS2 drive. And I can't, all the Googling in the world, I couldn't figure it out. So shit like that's driving me nuts. And then I tried Citrus 3000 PSI's CSync mod. I roped Ben from iFixRetro over here to try to help me out with that, and it seemed to work fine. So yeah, I mean it disables Luma and composite video, but light guns still work, and you plug it into like the OSSC, and it just works in all resolutions through RGBs. So it's pretty neat for people that need it, but yeah, I've just been revisiting the old project, clearing shit out, and just trying to sell off, as much as I can, as quickly as I can. But
so when you say you have so much work to do, that really means that you have to go and yell at Ben to do all the work.
Basically.
Kinda. I usually ask Ben to do the stuff that I either I'm not good enough to do, or that I want him to get good at it so I could do a video. And then when people, when I get 1,000 emails asking me where I could go to have the work done, I don't even really have to deal with that. I could just point them right to iFixRetro and say, don't bother me anymore. So yeah, that's pretty much it.
Better him than me.
You should have asked on NeoGAF instead of Atari Age or wherever you asked.
Well, Bob, I just wanted to say, Bob, the loading PS1 games off of HDLoader is a terrible experience, and you're better off to not be using it, because you realize that what they've done is they've extracted a very half-baked official PS1 emulator that runs on the PS2, but it is in fact full emulation. It can't take advantage of the R3000 CPU that's on board. It uses the emotion and the engine, the graphics synthesizer to do everything, and the emulation is pretty poor. So your best bet is to actually, play real PS1 games, or even, backups of games you legally own.
See, that's exactly what I wanted to find out for myself, because, the information on these forums is not great. I tried posting on NeoGAF, but apparently because I never assaulted anybody, they wouldn't take my post seriously.
Me too.
But no, I mean, that's exactly what I wanted to test. That's what I wanted to make, like a short little video about and show the difference, because My Life in Gaming did an awesome video about, how to use PS1 on PS2 and PS3, but they didn't go into any of the hacking modding stuff. And, anybody that's ever been over or sees my shit knows that, I definitely own the games that I play. But for testing, I love to have this stuff. And also, if I'm going to have a solution like a ROM cart where I have everything in one, I want to leave my carts nice and safe somewhere and not touch them. And it's the same thing with my PlayStation games, the 10 that I'll actually play. Like, I don't want to fumble with discs if I don't have to. But if you're saying it's not the same experience, I don't want to fuck with it. I'd rather put a mod chip in and use the CDR, or just use original games.
It was an emulator that was designed for the Japanese online service, and it was only designed to run properly with maybe a couple of very undemanding games. So people have hacked this thing up so that it can launch as a binary file, and they inject other ISOs to run it. But unfortunately, the emulation is not very fast, and since it has to totally emulate the entire PS1 environment, it's not got the horsepower, and it's just not very good. That's just my opinion. I don't know anything about PS2 stuff, so I'm just telling you from my own experience, it's not very good.
No, cool. I mean, I just because I guess the number one thing that popped into my mind was the PSIO is so coveted and so fucking hard to find. And it's like, why aren't more people talking about this? Even if it's a pain in the ass, eventually somebody could make a good guide for it. I would have loved to have done that, but but that's the answer then right there. The PSIO, when the game works correctly, is the same as the disc. And if this isn't, I'm all about making sure the right experience. So yeah, good. Thank you for that. I'll try to add a note to my site whenever I have time for that.
No, thank you.
Cool. You want to move on to... we only have one group topic this week, which I have listed here as, are Superguns destroying the accessories of your retro consoles? And it's meant to...
That's exactly how I word it for the podcast tomorrow morning. That's literally the first words out of my mouth when the actual podcast starts. Are Superguns destroying your consoles? That's funny.
Coming up.
So who wants to give a recap of Bob's
I can talk about it. Because...
no, I think René should, because isn't René the king of telling everybody their shit's going to blow up other people's shit? Aren't you ruining the internet with that?
But I barely followed this. I have no clue what I'm talking about.
Well,
Which,
Doesn't
which
matter.
according to a lot of people, would be exactly like my flashcard article. So.
Right,
Yeah.
because you clearly have no idea what you're talking about. Right.
well, the only reason I ever knew anything about it was because somebody who is very prominent in the arcade tournament world for fighters reached out to me and asked me, "How you doing, buddy? How you doing, Ben?" Asked, if I knew anything about it or if I could look at it or whatever, and they explained to me what was happening. And what it comes down to is there is a specific supergun that's available. And on the output of this thing, first of all, just a preface what a supergun is. A supergun is just a mechanism that allows you to interface arcade hardware and arcade boards with home consumer grade equipment, right? It's like a consoleization of arcade hardware. That's what a supergun is. But at any rate, on this particular supergun, on the output of the AV output, you have audio running out too, of course, with your video signals. Well, the problem was that there is a switch that will attenuate this audio level between what is compliant with SCART interfaces and home television broadcasting, basically. And if you put the switch in the other way, it's outputting plus 12 volts JAMA audio through the output into whatever you're plugging it into. And so the problem with that is because that 12 volt audio grossly violates, certain specification that other devices are built to comply with, it was breaking switches. Now, not a lot of switches, but maybe 3 or 4 switches were gone.
And specific, the gscart, right?
Specifically, Super G's gscart switch was being affected by this. So, I don't know if I should go any further.
I just want to put another layer of detail, which is that so the way this thing works is you have an arcade board, which has the interface that normally connects to the harness inside the arcade cabinet that connects your controllers and your video monitor and the audio, which are regular speakers, and it's called, like you said, it's the JAMA interface. It's an edge connector, and you normally plug this. It's a card edge that normally plugs into an edge connector that goes to all that stuff, and like you said, that has the audio, which is normally meant to drive those arcade speakers.
Yeah, directly.
But now, because you're interfacing this thing that's meant to go into consumer equipment, there is a audio attenuation switch there to make it so it's compliant, right? And so what you were saying was, since it's a selectable, you can select between the normal 12 volt level, rail level that goes to speakers versus consumer. And so when it was set to 12 volt and not going to speakers and going through silicon-based switching devices, like we've talked about in the past, it's violating those switching devices and blowing up their PN junctions, I guess.
Well, and I looked on the website for the Supergun, and I saw no documentation or forewarning concerning, manipulating the switch. Nowhere was it ever mentioned or stated. There was no disclaimer saying, if you send unattenuated 12 volt audio to your consumer equipment, it may yield damage. Because JAMA audio was never designed to interface with anything that's built for home television systems, right? In order to get audio out of the JAMA or out of the arcade interface, there needs to be some sort of line level conversion so it's safe for powered devices, right? So what happened was the explanation that I read, the defense for having that switch on there, because if it's a home unit, you don't need a switch, right? It's meant to be driven through home equipment. There should be no reason for that. But the reason that I read the defense for having that on there was older arcade boards may have dried capacitors, especially in the audio outputs, right? So naturally, their audio might be very, very, very low because you have some worn passive components. So if you flip that switch up, you're by like maybe a factor of 9 or 10, the amplitude of the audio raises. So for boards basically that just need servicing anyways in the first place, it's just a method so you can audibly hear them better.
So it seems like
not good.
I don't know if I agree with that risk assessment where it's less risky to correct for the failing PCB. You put in a selection that has a risk of violating interface specifications, I guess. I don't know.
Yeah. So, I mean, that was the explanation for that. And unfortunately, I just don't think that situation. Listen, guys, everybody makes mistakes. It's really a really simple thing, super easy to fix. Not a lot of people were impacted as a result of this. Like I said, I know of 3 or 4. Not a big deal. But the way it was handled and the exchange, not good.
Yeah, this is so funny. This might be the first time this is happening where Zach is actually being the diplomatic, polite one, and I'm about to be the douchebag. I don't think, I think, like you said, the situation wasn't ideal. I kind of am leaning more towards Steve's opinion on this, but in my personal opinion, if there was a big-ass sticker on the bottom that says, here for SCART, here for other, or if the guy just said, hey, my bad, let me send everybody a sticker out and, a nice clear picture that shows, input ports here so everybody knows how to do it, that's fine. But that's not what he did. His response was, well, clearly there's something wrong with your switch. Whoa! No. When you have one device that's built to work under a spec, and it works under that spec very nicely, and you have something out of spec plugged into it and it dies, that's that thing's fault. That's not the thing that was designed to spec. And that's what pissed me off. He called my video clickbait, so fuck that.
All your video, like every time when you post a video, you ask us if your title is clickbaity enough.
Except for the podcast. In the podcast, there was no thumbnail, and the description didn't even mention anything. It was a thing I said in passing. So
no,
yeah.
I'm of the opinion that what happened was some misunderstanding and some overly hasty analysis trying to figure out a problem that was directly impacting this guy's revenue. So it was hitting him in the pocketbook and it hurt, and I understand that he probably didn't do the best job of coming at it to begin with, but I think he probably at this point understands what's going on better now that people have kind of filled him in on what's
Explained
going on.
To him?
Yeah.
Now that people have explained it to him?
Sure.
Well, I tried to. I talked to the guy, and he's listen. I think he just was really emotional, and I explained a few things to him, and I just think that look, there's a right way and there's a wrong way of handling feedback, especially when it's on you, right? And that's just. It's a moment of teaching. That's all I'm going to say. It's just a moment of teaching.
Yeah. So this topic is, in my opinion, all boils down to just if there's some reason to have this 12 volt signal available, I really don't care if they want to put that on there. That doesn't. I mean, Steve's right from a risk perspective, but what all comes down to for me is the design of the thing does not indicate where that switch needs to be set. And if I go to the website to look at that product, I don't immediately see a way to download a manual. So I can't even look at a manual to know if there's something that tells you right away.
But we don't know if a manual ships with the unit, right?
Sure, but even if it does, it's common practice these days to put your manuals for things online so people could look at them. So I mean, it's not a huge deal. I don't think it's damning.
It's a documentation.
Yeah, this just needs to be documented a lot better. And I think, however, he's silk screening or putting text on his device needs to be improved so that people know.
Well, we've talked about one side of this, but I kind of wanted to address the other side because I think it's important in a general sort of way, where This device has been plugged into various audio-video switching devices for a long time, and then everything's okay, and then there's a report of it happening on the same model switch, the same problem. So intuitively, if you didn't think about it too much and you just like made a decision, you would say something is wrong with this unit because, hey, I've used it on 9 other things and it works fine, therefore this one is wrong. But I kind of want to point out that at first, if you just get that information right away, you can be misguided in your conclusion, but I don't think it's a valid conclusion to assume that.
Right.
And I think that I've seen stuff like this happen before in other devices, all sorts of other things where, hey, it works on these, it doesn't work on yours, therefore yours is misdesigned, it's not properly. I just don't understand the argument. It doesn't make logical sense to me.
Well,
I don't know.
That's what happens, Steve, when your emotions and your survival drive takes precedence over logic. Unfortunately, I mean, I see it all the time with people, and it happens. But you know, there's a right way and a wrong way to address that, and I just feel like maybe in the future, maybe in the future that can be handled better. For him, I don't know.
Yeah, and you know what? You know, we're nerds, and nerds are historically not great at marketing. And, you know, like, remember Intel back in the 90s with the Pentium processor fiasco? Where, like, only if you did mathematical equations to, like, the 10,000th place, everything was fine, but that might mess everything up. So rather than saying something like, hey, you know, we'll extend the warranty for everybody, and if you're in this one field, we'll replace it right away, Intel's response was, yeah, it won't matter. And everybody was like, fuck you. I remember being a kid and going into like Radio Shack or someplace, and for years, when people mentioned, about 2 years, when people mentioned Pentiums, people would scoff and be like, oh, those are junk. Don't those not work right? But that was just one nerd from Intel that didn't have any marketing training, and everything actually was fine. So we're not really great at this, but at the same time, putting a big sticker on it, or maybe at the very least learning from this and taking a deep breath next time would be the better answer, you know?
What about on the Switch side, though? Should anything be done there in terms of documentation or anything like that?
Yeah, I mean, you know, in hindsight, I wouldn't have thought of this before the Supergun fiasco, but I guess Super G might want to include a sheet of paper with every Switch that just says this Switch is designed for the SCART spec. Make sure whatever you plug into it is is SCART. Is also designed to the SCART spec. But you know, your warranty's void if you don't.
Your average consumer is not going to have a multimeter to plug in and test all the levels of everything on.
We don't.
Yeah, go ahead.
No, I'm sorry, I didn't mean to interrupt you. I was just you just reminded me, Dick. It's like the SCART cable video I did with the Genesis. Now putting a TTL logic level sync signal to the FrameMeister. If you look at the data sheet for the FrameMeister, that ADV 7430, whatever it is, you're violating the absolute maximum power ratings pretty grossly. Now, what could happen, I don't know, but is it Microsoft's position that, well, if you damage it, it's on the SCART cable and not us? Or no, I'm sorry, I said that backwards. Who is it on? If you plug in a Genesis cable that has 5-volt logic level coming out of it and going into the FrameMeister, does the burden fall upon the person who made the SCART cable, or does the burden fall on Microsoft for not designing a device that can handle these sort of characteristics and conditions that are outside of a certain specification that it was designed for in the first place? Should they have a disclaimer on their product saying, "Don't be a dumbass"?
I think there's no right answer to that.
Yeah,
question.
And I think this is something that's really unique to what we all do, because generally speaking, like if you were to make a product that's going to be sold to tens of thousands of people, you have to have some kind of certification on it. I mean, technically everybody's supposed to get certification on everything, but that's just not realistic. And you wouldn't really go through this. Like if this was the 90s and you were going to make a cable for a Genesis and you had to get UL tested on it or something, you'd know right away if it failed, and then it would be on the cable seller, definitely. But when you're talking about the quantities of tens, hundreds, or thousands, I guess, in the case of the FrameMeister, it's hard to put blame on somebody. And it's something that we all need to share, obviously, share our experiences and do crap like this to make sure we're all into it. But it's really tough because if you put everybody, even the little guys that make 10 or 20 or something, under those same stringent things, nothing would ever get released, even stuff that is perfect. So
That's true.
Yeah, I'm glad you bring up the UL, the Underwriters Lab, Bob, because and you're right. For smaller numbers, you're not going to go out and get your device certified or whatnot, because that's going to cost a fortune. But just as an example, like for a company that's manufacturing a product that, say, has USB on it, and I'll use USB because I've gone through UL testing with the USB device at work. There's a very specific set of tests and parameters that you need to pass in order to be able to call your device USB, right? You need to survive short circuits for a certain duration of time. And they actually, the test guy actually put a screwdriver right in the plug, and he shorted the ground to 5 volts, and he said, okay, I'm going to leave it like that for 24 hours. And if your device is fine afterwards, right, then you can call it USB, right? So there's a whole bunch of things like that make it so that it's good, it's legal to call it USB. And a device that has a USB port on it anywhere that has passed a UL test should survive that same beating. But that's never going to happen with retro gaming SCART connectors or SCART switches, because nobody's ever going to go to a UL test. Is there even a UL standard for SCART?
Well, even if there was, something to just mention, I don't know what a consumer grade UL testing is, but when we got our computers tested for medical grade, which is a lot more stringent, I think it was almost $100,000 to do that. Mm-hmm. So you're not going to make something that you sell 1,000 of and don't even make the amount of money that you would have to make in order to get it certified.
Probably the most relevant thing to this industry is the HDMI licensing. Most of the products that you see out there by these small places, well, even the large ones, aren't properly HDMI licensed. They haven't gone through that testing because, one, it costs a lot of money. Two, you have to really design it to pass the spec, and then
that's
beyond
the downside, right?
Yeah, and then the initial cost is not the only cost, because you also have to pay them a percent of every sale, or a commission on every sale. I don't think it's a percent. It's like a dollar. I forgot what it was.
It's like 40 cents or something. It's a royalty.
Yeah, royalty depending on how many you do per year.
But there's a trade-off there, because you get it's for the consumer. It's better to have the certification, because then that they went through the testing. On a lot of these devices that didn't go through testing, there's a lot of funky quirks in the behavior, and it's because they weren't tested at each. The way they do the testing, there are requirements, and they're numbered, and every requirement has a test that's defined, and you must pass all those tests, so you meet all the requirements. It's kind of simple, but
to bring it back, though, even if these devices had been tested to pass some spec, if you throw it 12 volt audio, or if you throw it 5 volt TTL, that's out of spec, and that could do damage, and it doesn't solve the problem of handling these edge cases of people doing things wrong, and doesn't solve the problem of educating people or figuring out a way for these people to easily test whether the equipment they're buying. It's great if one device passes the spec, but if the other device doesn't, this doesn't matter, right?
Yeah. And then there's one more thing I wanted to point out on this. So, you could go on who's really at fault or whatever, but in the end, both if let's say in general, if this happens with two pieces of equipment made by two different people or two different manufacturers, I think it's better practice to document that this happened, and this is kind of what we did on our cables. We have an issues list and we have a severity of issue, like if it's high, low, or medium, and you document these issues. And we had a bunch of low priorities, which they're very low, they're minor, but you're not going to go and re-implement a new circuit revision to fix it. But then when you get one that's high, it forces you to do a new revision, then you could go ahead and implement all those things. So in the case of the switch, it's just something to document, maybe put series resistors. If there is another higher priority issue that forces you to do a change, then you could go ahead and implement that just to avoid cases like these. Because even if, who cares, it's not my fault, you don't want to have to deal with it, right? You don't want somebody to have something blown up and then you have to deal with support and all that stuff. It's just, I think it's better practice to just, document this, have it in like a list. And if you're forced to do some sort of change, just do a minor investigation on what it would take to fix the minor issues too, and if they're even worth it.
Good point.
All right, you want to move on to some questions?
Yep.
Sure.
All right. Let's start with this one. With the SNES, it's possible to modify the output for digital audio using Bordy's board with the Toslink output jack. Is it possible in the future to create such a mod for other consoles like the Genesis, and if not, why? My limited understanding is the Sony chip the SNES uses actually creates digital audio information that can be pulled. How hard would it be to somehow digitize the Genesis sound and pull it such that it doesn't pass through analog processing, or is that even possible?
The Genesis audio is not like the SNES audio, right? There's no digital representation of it anywhere that's available on the board. A solution that you could do would have to be something like the HDMI NES, right? Where a lot of that functionality would have to be emulated in hardware to be able to have it output digitally.
Emulated or simulated? Sorry.
You could simulate your FPGA implementation of it in the whatever Xilinx or Altera simulator.
Is that simulator or stimulator, Renee? I'm asking both of you.
What about other consoles? I mean, he kind of focused on the Genesis, but his original question did kind of...
Well, the N64 you could do that for. The PC Engine, there is no digital audio. There's digital video. There is no digital audio on the PC Engine, is there, Renee?
No, there isn't. You just have a few like wavetable-like registers, and you write values to them, and that's about it.
No,
But
Renee,
the Saturn, the 3DO, the PlayStation, the GameCube, there's at least two more that you could actually do. Any ones that use that similar audio chip, you actually can do with the digital audio mod.
see, I was thinking maybe there was a way, I guess, to get into the DAC of one of those lines, but it doesn't matter. It doesn't make it. Forget it. Yeah, I think, the Saturn, N64, PS1, right?
Yep, PS1, and definitely the 3DO as well, so you can get audio out of that one good game it has.
Yeah. Actually, Ace in the chat brings up a good point. Is even if you could do that on Genesis, then what do you do about the Sega CD and the 32X? Because they both provide audio.
It's good.
God knows
Checkmate.
if you're gonna do digital audio on the Genesis, you want to absolutely be able to play Cosmic Carnage with it on 32X.
And if you're going to use anything on the Genesis board, like if Genesis systems that have the ASIC integrated, you have no access to the Zilog's bus, so you wouldn't even be able to grab anything from there anyways, even if you did want to make some sort of parasitic board. Does that make sense, Renee?
Oh, it depends. Some boards have a discrete Z80 processor on there, so you could intercept the data being written to it, but that's only part of the data, right? Because usually the PSG was built into the VDP, to the video display processor.
That's right.
So the audio subsystem is not nice and isolated like it is on the... Well, it is nice, sorry, but it's not isolated like it is on SNES.
Of course you would say that.
What are your guys' thoughts on bypassing the voltage regulator in retro consoles to power it with something like a USB power supply?
I think we went over this stuff already, didn't we? Yeah, but very, very big thumbs down. Those USB power supplies are very noisy, and for a lot of the analog stuff in these consoles, it's going to be very susceptible to that high frequency switching noise. So you want something cleaner. I guess if you can find something super ultra clean, then at that point, why not just plug it in the back and run it through the linear regulator that's already on there? That'll roll off even more frequency noise and help you out even more.
Yeah, I guess to summarize what we had said last time is if you're using a switching regulator, the console was designed with a 60 hertz input in mind, and it's going to filter that out, but it's not going to filter out the high frequencies. So.
Right.
Yeah.
Exactly.
Its power supply rejection ratio rolls off significantly after 120 hertz.
Right. What about?
Sorry. Regarding René's discovery about how the Genesis problems with sound, about how it's being processed on the software end, is that something that could be corrected and patched in a ROM? He's referring to that picture that, I don't know if it was like 2 podcasts ago, where you show how it kind of goes to 0 for a fraction of a second.
Where it's got to wait for the CPU, right?
Yeah.
Yeah. It's the audio has a dead portion during some the V blank usually when DMA is happening. Yes, that is totally possible. Steph, the author of SGDK, actually rewrote the engine for, I think it's Super Street Fighter 2. It significantly improves the sample quality. So I mean, if you've got a lot of time on your hands, you can definitely do that.
Yeah, that is really cool. I haven't heard about that.
That's awesome. I didn't know that. And I've talked to Steph before too in the past. He's a cool guy.
This happened quite a few years ago. I mean, it was during the time where I actually thought going on a forum was okay.
It's like 30 years ago.
I think he's the first guy who introduced me to the term composite. Or composite. He's like, here in France we call it composite.
I think that's a perfectly accurate description of it. Yeah.
I like how if you go into the SGDK API, and maybe he's fixed it now, but a lot of the descriptions where he deals with transfer, there's always a T at the end of transfer, because in French that's how you spell it. Yay, French.
This comes from someone who watched our podcast for an hour waiting for the OSSC review, thinking
and wanted more because it was so.
and was hoping for our real opinions on it, but he said that he thought it was hilarious and really enjoyed it, but he also wants to know if he could get what we really thought of the OSSC. Is it worth it? Should he just get the FrameMeister? He heard that connecting anything other than SCART is a pain in the butt because of audio. Is that still true? And he said
just need an adapter.
He heard that DB Electronics say that a giant bundle of Ethernet cables will be better at handling signal than the OSSC.
That was Nick.
So much.
That was Nick. I asked him, was it Cat 5 or Cat 5e or Cat 6?
So Nick, weren't you working on something for the Raspberry Pi where somebody could load up this image and then it would generate the exact signals that the OSSC would generate with like Super Nintendo or something, so people could pre-test their TVs? Or was that just one experiment that went along, went along the ways of your Dreamcast cable?
It wasn't.
That hurts related. Because I was up all night Sunday night working on stuff after all weekend. Sorry,
the Raspberry Pi thing was separate. That was the 240p HDMI device to just test TVs. Because one of the things we wanted to do is get a cheap HDMI pass-through device made so that people who were having trouble with the component might be able to use HDMI, and it would be way cheaper than anything that upscales. But yeah, that's separate. So as for the OSSC, I don't know. Me and René are the only ones that own the 1.6, right? Or do you own one, Bob?
I currently own 2, but it might be 1 soon.
I own one, but I didn't open it yet.
Oh, you got okay.
I have 1.
Yes. I also have that one too.
I didn't realize you guys had the new ones.
Sorry, go ahead.
I didn't mess with it at all.
So are we supposed to give our real opinions now?
Yeah, I guess that's the goal here.
I absolutely love it. My 2 only complaints about it at all. One of them is just inherent in the way it works, is that you can't guarantee that every line mode will work with every TV. So my last TV only worked in 2x mode. My current TV works in 5x mode on everything except Super Nintendo, which is a little annoying. But that's just the way it works. And you know, at the moment, there's no way to get to download and add profiles like the Firebrand X ones for the FrameMeister, which isn't really necessary for every console. But goddamn, those things are cool. But that's it. It's my only really 2 complaints about it.
You can save your own profiles at least.
You can, so we could eventually just come up with a chart, you know, well, if your TV is compatible with this mode, then do this, and you could sit there just like people used to do with the FrameMeister, but it would be very nice to just be able to have patches that you could send along.
Yeah, I mean, my opinion of it, I mean, I think it does a really nice job. It's, as we've kind of mentioned in the last podcast, I don't think any of us feel it's the most consumer-friendly device, just because the menu system is so damn complicated, even for people like us who know this stuff fairly well. I mean, there's a lot of features buried within those menus that you can get lost in and not know exactly what they're doing without looking at some kind of reference. So from that perspective, it's not the most consumer-friendly, but it does a really good job at what it does. The HDMI output is nice. That audio thing I think he's referring to is the fact that on previous models, if you were going component, you would have to route the audio separately. But now you can just take like a red and white RCA to headphone jack type adapter, and then the only thing is you have to like flip a little switch that if you have fat fingers like probably all of us do except for maybe Steve, it's impossible to switch without like a little paper clip or something, but that makes it super easy to use the audio now.
What about you, René?
Yeah, well, like Nick said, I think the main complaint I had was flicking that switch. I mean, I think why would you not want it in that position? So, and it ships in the wrong position. So, I mean, I think they should flick it at the factory or whatever, and they should ship it to you ready to accept audio. Yeah. Otherwise, it's awesome.
If that's your complaint about it, that's fucking awesome.
You know, just kind of an aside, but in our testing manual for the factory for our cables, we actually do specify the position that we want the switch in after they're finished testing, because we want it, you know, if somebody's going to take their cable out of the bag and not mess around with that switch, there's a position for each cable that we'd prefer it to be in, right?
Yeah.
It's in the 50-page document.
Yeah. Who knows if they actually follow it, but
they do. I think they have.
Well, I mean, we haven't looked at every single cable, but
well, you're talking about in terms of the switch,
right?
I think
right.
We set up the test such that it will fail the test fixture if it's not in that position at the end.
Sure.
Hey, Nick, I have a question. Well, can we? There's actually kind of an important question I saw come through chat, and I was wondering, are we going to field maybe 1 or 2 questions after we get done with our already phrased questions? Okay, because there's something I'd really like to address. Okay, thank you. Continue.
Yeah, I actually wrote down a question from chat too that I want to answer.
Yeah, if you see some, just save them off. We're almost through the saved ones, but I feel like we owe these people some answers.
What are you talking about, chat? I have AOL Instant Messenger pulled up. I don't know what you guys are talking about.
I didn't think that ran on your flip phone, Steve.
All right, here's
You can run apps on a phone?
They have the internet on computers now?
So, all right. I recently went back to the guts of my AV Famicom to clean up my original NES RGB mod and add a palette switch, zapper mod, and JTAG, yada yada. Noticing some noise in the video signal when hooking it up to the OSSC. He says he's pretty sure he's narrowed it down to something wrong in just the Famicom. Suddenly realized I don't know anything about the wire I'm currently using except that it comes in a colorful rainbow ribbon. So I'm hoping to use really good wire as a crutch for his long runs of wire. Can you make specific recommendations for wire to use?
I can answer that. Part of that.
Yeah, go for it.
So, if you're wanting to drive analog video and audio too, the ribbon wire that I use, and people ask me this all the time, and it's a generic answer. It's just 26 or even 28 AUG ribbon, stranded ribbon wire, and that is more than sufficient. 1.27 pitch is what I like to use, by the way. But at any rate, that is more than sufficient to drive analog video and analog video and audio. Now, as far as the length of your runs, if you keep that under 8 inches, if you try to go for 6, try to get 6 inches in there. If you can get 6 inches in there, you're going to be in pretty good shape. There's not going to be a lot of room for things to go awry. But there's a couple of things that are important to note when it comes to the NES RGB, and I actually spoke about this on a Shmups thread a few days ago. A lot of people have brought their systems to me, and they have complained of certain ghosting and tracing noise, right? Well, the problem is that people are installing NES RGB systems in AV Famicoms that have a multi-out port or a top loader system that they've put a multi-out port in. Now, what does an SNES SCART cable have in it? It has 220 microfarad capacitors, right? What's on the NES RGB board? NES RGB board, 220 microfarad capacitors. So you're stacking these AC coupling capacitors in series, and when you stack a cap in series, you're actually having the total capacitance. So if you have 2 sets of 220s in there, you're actually going to get 110 microfarads of capacitance. Now, there are standards for AC coupling video, and what's good and what's tolerable and what isn't. At minimum, you want 200 microfarads of capacitance when you AC couple. Anything less than that, and you can experience a voltage error, which visually represents itself as a ghosting effect. It's called video field tilt, line tilting, video field tilting. So my suggestion to you would be, before you remove any of your conductors, take the 220 microfarad, 3 of them, for RG and B, take those 3 caps off the board and just bridge them, because you've already got those caps in the cable, and you're only hurting your visual clarity potentially if you keep them in there. Now, another point, if this was a recently purchased NES RGB kit, Tim Worthington recently found out that his fabrication vendor or supplier went against his bill of materials, and the voltage regulator that he called for, the fabrication house was actually using a very generic part. Well, the generic part operates a little differently than the good quality part that he has listed.
So it was a clone. It was a clone, damn it.
It's a counterfeit. Yeah, it's a counterfeit part of the LDO or the voltage regulator that he specifies. And in order to, and it oscillates. It oscillates because there are bypass caps to filter and condition off this regulator, but the generic part, it needs a lot more than what's on the board. So the fix for that is just to add a 10 microfarad, I guess, ceramic on the rail of that voltage regulator. And so if it's a recent, what I'm saying is, if it's a recent purchase that you've bought, an NES RGB kit, maybe that's all you need to do. But nonetheless, both of my points still stand. So I hope that helps your body.
I
whole forum thread there that you don't have to read because it's laid out in Zach's speech.
Thank you.
Yeah, you just reminded me. Somebody for the Q&As for my weekly podcast asked about the CSync line when you're trying to use those cables, and I answered directly to that. But now I kind of wish I had gone back and deleted it because their question was specific to the CSync line. But if they're asking the question, they probably don't realize that there's also caps on the RGB lines as well that have to do with it. Crap, I wonder if I have time to re-edit my fucking podcast.
René?
So, yeah, Zach, I just want you to clarify one thing about your whole spiel there is how exactly do you get 6 inches in there?
So, René, I
If
know
you've
it's really
only
hard.
got 4 to work with.
Oh, that's even better.
I know this might be really hard for you to understand, René.
Yeah, because I deal in metric.
Yeah.
But exactly, 3 millimeters. We don't really use that here. But what I'm saying is I don't know. I don't know how you get. I guess you have to be gifted for that kind of thing, René. I don't have any problems.
Because you said 8, but then you went, 6 is okay. So.
Well, 6 is really the target. I mean, if you're going to have a run there, 6 is you really don't want to go over 6. Going over 8, yeah, you might run into some visual things that may be visually apparent, but typically there's no reason to have more than 4 or 5 inches of lead for any NES RGB installation that you do, whether it be on a front loader, twin Famicom, AV Famicom, top loader. Ooh, I don't hear. Do you read me?
Do you guys have any stance on games that are too expensive to get a legitimate copy of, are old and out of print, and are not available currently to purchase digitally? Is one just supposed to wait while hoping that such games will be officially released or remastered one day? I agree it is technically illegal to download a ROM of such games for use with an emulator, but it's certainly an annoying situation to try to maneuver legally. And then as a second follow-up question to that, any comment on how possible it would be to reverse engineer the BIOS for a disc-based console like the PS1?
I can only answer the second question. I don't. First question, I don't really play games, so I don't know what I don't play games anymore, so I don't look for super expensive games anyway because I have so many that are just sitting, not being played. But the second one, Polymega wrote BIOSes for I think all the CD consoles they're supporting. Neo Geo, PlayStation, Sega CD. They wrote their own. I think they even show off the speed gains they got in the their implementation of the Neo Geo BIOS versus the SNK's original. I don't know.
Okay.
It's been done, so it's not impossible, right?
Yeah, it's super difficult, but yeah, it's not.
You need to put a lot of effort.
Yeah.
Do it.
Yeah, and for the first question, I would say I have an opinion on that. Is I don't think it's necessarily right for someone to go out and sell reproductions of these games, right? Whether they're abandonware or not. I think legally that's wrong, and you shouldn't do that. But I think in the confines of your own home, if you're able to reproduce yourself those games, just to add to your collection to be able to play them or whatever, and you're not going to try to profit off of that, I don't really have a problem with that. Like I made myself a copy of Mega Man Wily Wars because it wasn't available, and I'm not going to go out and sell it, but this is the only real way for me to play it on my Sega Genesis without using an EverDrive.
I guess another facet of that question is, regardless of sort of the legal implications and entanglements, when you are reproducing games like Gimmick and other sort of neat little jewels that you just reasonably have no other way to play, are you really taking money out of anybody's pocket because it's on that secondary market now? Do you guys feel any sort of ethical is it an ethical quandary from you in that regard? Do you feel like you're ripping somebody off from and strictly a fiscal perspective?
Well, I know a lot of people that have made their own Gimmick carts, and I absolutely don't feel that is the slightest bit wrong, making your own. Selling repros, I don't really know how I feel about that, to be honest with you.
Me too. I'm not down. I don't think I don't know. I don't know how I feel about that. There's a lot of good games that I want to play that I just really can't get. I can't get it. Can't do it. So yeah, I make my own stuff.
Yeah, I mean, I think when you're talking about morality, like there are certainly gray areas, but then there are also areas where it does not. You can't really justify drawing the line. Like I can't say, hey, it's it's totally morally wrong to not go and buy yourself a copy of Aladdin for $2 on Genesis. But hey, well, I mean, Musha's $300, so go right ahead, right? Like either that act is morally right or wrong, and a dollar amount doesn't really make sense as a metric for drawing that line to me personally. I mean, but kind of as you guys have said, I don't really have that much of a problem with it if somebody can't afford to go get Musha and is going to just download the ROM or acquire it some way and, throw it on a cart and play it. But on the other hand of that equation, like these websites that host every single ROM of every game ever, I mean, that is a lot sketchier to me because you are infringing on copyright from companies that do reproduce those games as SNES Classic Minis or whatever the hell they want to put back out, and you are taking away from their business by letting people write stupid articles like, why get a SNES Classic when you can just get a Raspberry Pi and have every game ever for $15?
Yeah, well, to every clickbait shit from Kotaku with that. But the video game attorney had a pretty strong stance on that, in that if you're a website that has ads that distributes ROMs, that is not a gray area in his mind and in mine either. If especially some of those ones where you'd have to click through 20 ads to get to something, you are literally selling stolen property at that point. So that is.
But I think he would say even giving away stolen properties, like I don't think the ads would matter to him. But again, this is talking about the legal aspect of it, right?
Well, you're talking about sort of the distribution of wares is what you're talking about now.
Right. Like, I mean, the only reason I bring it up is because it kind of goes hand in hand. Like, on one hand, I don't care if someone wants to sit there and put a super rare ROM on a flash cart and play it because they can't afford to get a copy of it. But on the other hand, I do kind of object from a moral perspective these websites that host a bajillion ROMs so that you can download whatever you want whenever, because that does cheapen intellectual property for you're stealing somebody's code, you're stealing somebody's effort and labor, and you don't know that person is never going to make money off of that thing again. So it's certainly something that, at least for me, is a gray area morally, and I'm not sure how to feel about it yet.
Okay, I think we're all sort of at an impasse.
Yeah.
All right. So did you guys say there was questions from the chat you wanted to answer?
There's just one question I'd like to address. This came from I think his name was Lion Shark or Lionheart or something like that. He asked, can HD Retrovision confirm the checkerboard patterns on certain versions of the NES? Now, no matter how good your RGB cables are, I don't think you make RGB cables.
The SNES, not SNES.
I said SNES, Bob. Get over it.
You said NES.
Nick, no one's listening to you, Nick. On some revisions, this noise simply can't be avoided. Well, it's interesting that you mentioned that. I actually fixed that rather recently. A guy sent in a SNES APU-01. He sent
one of the worst ones. It's the worst revision.
It's the worst revision of all time. He sent it to me because he thought that the serial number would corroborate with a one-chip system. So, he's wanting me to install the bypass board, right? Well, I disassemble it, and he's like, I'm sorry, guy, it's not a one-chip. I'll put this back in the mail for you. But I'll tell you what I'll do. I'll look at it. I'll look at it because he said the video was awful. And just like you asked, or just like you kind of explained, the horrible sort of 45-degree-ish clock bars and the crosshatch checkerboarding pattern was all over the place. And the problem I found with that system is after probing and sort of capturing plots in a bunch of different areas, pin 3 of PPU2 is the 3.58 megahertz color carrier for composite video. And the way that this is routed, it couples capacitively into your video outputs, your RGB signals. It should never have been ran the way it was, but it was. So the solution to your checkerboarding problem, for pretty much, I would just go ahead and say for any of those revisions, is to lift pin 3, lift the subcarrier output, lift that pin off the PPU, and drive the subcarrier out of circuit and patch it with a wire into its little resistor. Now, if you want some better explanation of that, you can get with me on the Twitter or something. But basically,
why don't you do a video about it?
No, I'm not gonna do a video about it. I've got shit to do. But I'm sorry. I can't waste time on that bullshit. But listen, pull it out of circuit and terminate it off the board. That'll remove that sort of capacitance coupling issue, and you will no longer have this shit. So that's the fix for that.
Yeah, there was some guy who contacted us a while back, and I suggested that he should try that because I had the schematic for that revision drawn out, and I said you could try doing this, but I never heard back. So it's good to have feedback on confirmation that is really the issue. Also, another question: if he doesn't care about composite or S video anymore, can he just lift the pin and just forget about it and just use?
Sure. So unlike the Sega Genesis, unlike the Master System, see, the Master System has a very similar problem where the subcarrier is routed so closely to your analog video signals that it couples in. The Master System's, the color carrier signal is 3.58 megahertz in NTSC land. Well, the CPU of the Master System references this clock, and that's how the Z80 gets its clock. The Super Nintendo, you don't have to worry about any of this because that 3.58 subcarrier signal isn't referenced by the CPU or anything. So if you don't care about composite video, you can just lift pin 3, the subcarrier, you can just lift it out of circuit and be totally done. But
or S video.
Or if you don't care about S video either. So if you do that, if you lift the pin out of circuit and you connect composite video, well, the chroma data is going to be missing. So composite video will effectively just be Luma. You'll have no color data in your encoding.
So I actually have two questions for that. When is it necessary to use a shielded cable when you're bypassing the subcarrier like that around? Is there specific consoles that you know of? I'll let you answer that first, and I'll answer.
Here's my opinion on that, and this is just my opinion. Don't take it for fact, but we're talking about maybe 3-inch, 4-inch runs here, and the short wire distance and just pulling it out of circuit. I don't think there's enough. I don't think that there's enough gigawatt electromagnetic flux in that short run to really allow it to couple to anything. I don't see the need in using shielded cables to do this simple patchwork.
But that doesn't depend on your distance between your traces, your relevant traces on the board, and how high you run the wire. Another reason why I don't recommend, well, there's a bunch of reasons, but here's a main reason why I do not recommend using Kynar 30 AUG wire or any sort of Kynar jacketed conductor to drive video. The more space you put between your conductor and the substrate of the board, the less chances there are of signals coupling into one another. So the reason I use this rainbow ribbon wire, this 28 AUG conductor, is because the poly jacketing on it is very, very thick, and it's just putting that much more distance between the traces on the main board and the actual conductor itself. So if you use a nice thickly jacketed conductor, we really don't have anything to talk about, in my opinion. That's just my opinion. Take it for what it's worth.
No, because I know we've done some experimenting before on other stuff, just on benchtop things. But as long as you run it nice and you use decently shielded cable. And a couple people in the chat were asking, so to try to make this simple without taking up the rest of the time, whenever you run a signal that's a similar frequency next to other stuff that's similar, you get interference. So by pulling this up and moving it around away from those other signals. That's how you can get rid of the interference, just to try to give it the short version.
They don't have to be the same frequencies.
Right. I'm
Doesn't
sorry.
matter.
Just trying to oversimplify it for people to visualize. And
Just
the other,
any two signals running next to each other will couple.
And it's actually something I asked last week, but apparently, just because I'm in the retro roundtable doesn't mean my questions get bumped to the top. Does anybody, any of your experiences, do you guys have a SNES 2-chip model that you think is actually really good, other than that blurring effect thingy?
The APU was fucking awesome after I did this mod for that guy. It looks very, very, very good.
I think the best that doesn't require any sort of internal messing around with is the original model, which is the SHVC CPU 01 model, because it doesn't have any of the coupling problems, and because the RGBs are driven out through PNP transistors, it has less of the vertical bar issue from what I've seen, versus other models that run it through some sort of encoder.
Gotcha. Okay. And I know there's that OSSC update that's coming up that's supposed to help that filtering thing to put the blurring back. So I can't wait to try that out. I have one of the original launch models, and it's ugly as sin. I'm actually going to be trying Retro Bright for the first time on that.
It'd be interesting to know what you think, because me and Nick developed an algorithm for that a couple years ago that we were going to implement. So,
is there a way to actually implement that into analog at all? Like, could you guys have a little dongle that you put in or something that does that?
Oh, no, this was going to be on our HDMI thing.
He's doing it in software, Bob.
Yeah, I mean, is there any way for anybody to make a little add-on installed either internally or plugged into the back that could actually do this, de-blur, for lack of a better word?
You can do it in analog. You could.
You can. It's harder because in analog you do not have a certain type of filter, which is what you normally use for all video in the digital domain. It's just called an FIR filter, and without that, it's very hard to make a similar filter that has no phase distortion. That's a very important property of FIR filters, and why they're used a lot in digital video is they do not produce any phase distortion, where every analog filter, or most analog filters, produce some sort of phase distortion. And they kind of, what that means is if you have like a step, you want it to be a uniform step. Instead, you get all these like ringings and stuff, these ringing distortions. And if you're trying to do something kind of weird where you're sharpening edges, there's always some phase shift in your analog filter when you do stuff like that.
Gotcha. Okay.
Very difficult. I would not expect that to
work well.
Work well at all.
All right. Thank you.
Yeah.
I had a question I wanted to answer from the chat. Earlier, when I was doing my whiteboard thing, Adam Zay asked, "What's the difference between an FPGA and a CPLD?" So I'm gonna take out the whiteboard again and show this really, really quickly. Is a CPLD actually implements logic using something called sum of products, and basically what it is there's a bunch of inputs that come in. I'm just going to model two of them here, but it's doing, like, we're going to have A, B, C, and D going to AND gates, and then those feed into an OR gate. So you have the sum, which is the OR of the products, which is the AND function, and then usually in most CPLDs that does kind of like the output of the FPGA did, right? This goes to a flip-flop that can be clocked, or you can get that output directly there, like this. So you can select what you're going to get and so on, and you can clock this or whatnot. So the main difference.
Can you hold it centered? Because
sorry, I'm looking at it. So the main difference is the CPLD is really good at doing combinational logic. It's really good at doing and or and stuff like that. If you're going to implement registers in a CPLD, you're wasting all of the combinatorial logic for every one register, for every one D flip-flop that you're trying to use, right? So if you're going to do something that's register intensive, you might as well do it in an FPGA. Whereas if you want to do just some address decoding or whatnot, then probably a CPLD is a better way to put it, because it's got the hardware for that. It can do all those and or functions very easily. It's optimized for that. Another big difference too is the CPLD usually has a lot less configurations in it, so the configurations are stored internally in a flash or EEPROM, whereas FPGA has a lot of memory. So it has usually an external flash, and then on startup, the FPGA has to load all of that information into its internal RAM. So a CPLD is kind of almost instant on, whereas an FPGA needs a few milliseconds, a few hundred milliseconds before it can actually start up.
That's actually important for people who try to reverse engineer your products. CPLD, since it has that configuration built in, it's harder to sniff that bit stream out, where if you have the FPGA and the external SPI flash, you could look at the SPI flash bus, and that's why newer FPGAs implement encryption mechanisms between your two things, so to prevent type of like stealing binary blobs off of there.
Yeah, absolutely. Some of the newer families are actually implementing the flash directly in the FPGA.
Yes, I've seen that.
Yeah, but I mean, most of the products out there, like you said, you can sniff out the bit stream.
Okay. Next.
Alrighty. Well, that's I think all we have, unless there's other questions from the chat that we wanted to get to.
Somebody was asking about your hair, but I think they might have been trolling.
Oh, Ace has something. Hold on. I feel like he's going to troll us, though.
I know. I kind of hope he does. I kind of hope he just draws, or he posts a picture of a whiteboard with dicks on it just to troll René.
ASCII art penis, yes. Hey, I love my whiteboard. I was actually thinking maybe I should go stream this from my office at school and have a huge blackboard behind me.
That would actually be kind of cool. And I like stuff. I even like Steve's ghetto printouts that he holds up to the thing.
I want to get the overhead projector that René showed me and have like a projector screen and like me putting slides on it.
I should do that next time just to spite you.
Hey Ace, if you're talking, I do have an OLED 4K, but it's the 2016 version, and I think what you're talking about might be on the LCD versions.
What's the question?
All right, we have a few questions now. They're flying in. Has anyone tried using a retro console via a scaler on LG's new 4K TVs with RGB pixel structure? Do the staggered subpixelers make a mess out of the signal? I don't know what he's talking about. I don't have...
Sounds like they got some like non-uniform subpixels where RGB might be like offset more than usual.
I would like to see that.
Yeah, I can kind of comment a little bit on this, not too much, but I do know from being at the actual LCD manufacturing facilities in Taiwan that when they start manufacturing these, it's literally like $1 billion with a B to make one of these huge factories that spits out these panels. So when a new technology comes out like SED or OLED, even if it's infinitely better, they would rather spend a few million trying to find better ways, whether it's gimmicky or whether it's legit, to squeeze as much more as they can out of those LCD panels so they don't have to, redo their whole facility. So a lot of the things, like the QLED panels and there was a bunch of stuff that came out in the past 5 or 6 years that some of it was cool, some of it was bullshit. So I literally just ignore all that marketing. So what Ace was talking about might actually be legit cool tech, but my brain just blurs that out nowadays because I I've seen behind the curtain. I've seen, pay no attention to the man behind the curtain. I've seen the man.
All right, can you use HD Retrovision cables on an NES modded with Tim Worthington's RGB kit with the SNES style multi-out? We actually answered this on our website. Plenty of people have done this, and it has worked fine, but it's not something we officially support. So if you have any problems, don't bother us on our email with it. See, there was another one up here.
No, you should email Bob about that.
Yeah, send all problems to Bob. Do we have any news on the STEE body pillows? Working on it.
What the hell are they talking about?
No, the STEE body pillows. It was, I think we're gonna sell those like anime style pillows that people can snuggle with, but instead of a anime girl in a schoolgirl outfit, it's gonna be you on there.
Oh, those are a production.
Yeah.
We're
waiting for samples.
Yeah.
I was asking earlier about the Genesis 1 Models 1 stereo audio mod. What specifically does it improve? What is the benefit versus using the front port? Is that the Mega audio?
You mean what's the difference between stereo modding a Model 1 or using the headphone buffer to do that?
Yeah.
That headphone has a lot of distortion, a lot of THD from what I've heard, but a lot of people don't care. And
well, in fairness, I think that varies greatly between revisions. Like, there's some radical differences between like the VA1 to the VA4 in both the way it drives audio to the headphones and how it drives it out through the mono circuit. Ace would be the guy to talk to about that.
Ace
Yeah,
is the place.
that's what he's saying in the chat is the CXA 1034, which is the headphone amplifier. He says it has high THD, total harmonic distortion.
Yeah.
So confirmed, it's true.
Yeah. And I just made that up.
That's about does it, I guess, right? We got all the questions in the chat. Everybody good?
Well, alrighty, you guys want to call it a night? We're just about 2 hours now.
I think we had a great one, and CD.
Yeah, I think that's good. I think we call this one a win. We got, whatchamacallit, everything will be posted tomorrow for anybody that missed us. You can go back and check everything out.
Yeah.
When's the next big get together? We usually go every 2 weeks, right? So.
Yeah, so I guess holidays are coming up, so we're gonna have to be smart about working around things like that. Maybe it's gonna be either in 2 or 3 weeks, probably.
On Thanksgiving.
Yeah.
What are you guys talking about? Thanksgiving was a few weeks ago.
You have to skip your Black Friday shopping and your dinners with your families in order to catch the next one. So yeah, cool.
Nick,
what's up?
Can I give like a 20-second answer to a question that I think is kind of important?
Sure.
Can you say anything in 20 seconds?
Couldn't even ask that question in 20 seconds.
Don't get paralyzed, Bob, by your
Now.
Okay, so somebody asked, is there a right way and a wrong way for attenuating video amplitude on arcade hardware for like a Supergun? And the answer for that is yes and no. You have to keep in mind that arcade hardware, most of it is all 5-volt logic anyways, but some of it's kind of wonky. So you can't attenuate.
Oh, that was great, Zach. We have to leave.
You can't attenuate for one and necessarily attenuate for all the other X Factor corner case arcade boards out there. That's all I was going to say.
Alrighty. Well, thanks everyone for joining. We'll be back in 2 or 3 weeks. If you don't already, please subscribe so that you get the notification before we go live next time. Follow us on Twitter, HD Retrovision, DB Electronics, Retro YPBPR, and Voultar's Mod Shop. And you'll be good to go. So we'll see you guys next time. Thanks.
All right, guys. Take it easy.
Have a good night.
See you guys.
Until next time, bitches.